Marcus Chen had always been told that humans were the weakest species in the galaxy. Standing barely 6 feet tall with fragile bones and thin skin, humans were considered nothing more than maintenance workers and servants across the Galactic Federation. But, as he watched Princess Celera collapse in the palace courtyard, her blue blood seeping through her silver dress, Marcus knew he would risk everything to save her. The attack had come without warning. The Korthak Empire, a brutal race of insectoid warriors, had launched a surprise assault on the peaceful planet of Etheria. Their massive ships blotted out the twin suns as they descended like mechanical vultures. The royal palace, with its crystalline towers and floating gardens, was their primary target. Marcus had been working in the palace's lower levels, maintaining the atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable for the diverse alien species who lived there. As the first explosions rocked the building, he had rushed upward, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain. Most humans would have run the other way, seeking shelter in the reinforced bunkers. But Marcus was different. He found Princess Celera in the courtyard, surrounded by the bodies of her fallen guards. The elegant Etherian nobility lay scattered like broken dolls, their translucent skin already beginning to fade from its natural blue to a sickly gray. The princess herself was barely conscious, a plasma burn across her shoulder and cuts from falling debris marking her otherwise perfect features. The Etherian people were beautiful by any standard. Tall and graceful, with skin that shifted between pale blue and silver depending on their emotions, they moved like dancers and spoke in musical tones. Princess Celera was considered the most beautiful of them all, with long silver hair that seemed to float even without wind and eyes like captured starlight. Marcus had seen her from a distance many times during his work shifts. She had always been kind to the human workers, unlike many of the other nobility who barely acknowledged their existence. Once, she had even smiled at him when he'd quickly repaired a malfunctioning gravity lift she was waiting to use. That smile had stayed with him for months. Now, as he knelt beside her broken form, Marcus felt something burning in his chest. It wasn't just attraction or admiration. It was the same feeling that had driven humanity to survive ice ages, to build ships and sail unknown oceans, to reach for the stars despite being told they were too weak, too primitive, too insignificant. "Princess," Marcus whispered, gently lifting her head. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and pained. The archives," she managed to say, her voice barely audible over the sound of distant explosions. "The quantum archive, they cannot find it." Marcus understood immediately. The Royal Archives contained the technological secrets of a dozen civilizations, including the location of ancient weapons that could turn the tide of any war. If the Korthaks found it, they would become unstoppable. "Where?" Marcus asked. "Hidden, in my chambers, behind the..." Her head rolled to the side as unconsciousness took her. Marcus looked around desperately. The palace was collapsing around them, and he could hear the chittering voices of Korthak soldiers getting closer. Any moment now, they would find the courtyard. He had perhaps minutes to act. Without hesitation, Marcus scooped the princess into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her bones hollow like a bird's as was common among her people. But, even unconscious, she was the most beautiful being he had ever held. The human quarters were in the deepest part of the palace, in sections that most aliens never bothered to explore. If Marcus could get there, he might be able to hide her long enough to figure out their next move. But, first, he needed to reach her chambers and retrieve whatever she was trying to tell him about. Marcus had spent 3 years working in this palace, and he knew every maintenance tunnel, every service corridor, and every forgotten passage. While the Korthak soldiers smashed through the main halls, Marcus carried the princess through a network of hidden routes that most people didn't even know existed. The sounds of battle echoed through the walls around them. Plasma weapons discharged with sharp cracks, followed by the sounds of crystalline architecture shattering. Occasionally, Marcus heard the distinctive war cries of different species, the howling of the wolf-like Fenari guards, the harmonic battle songs of the Etherian soldiers, and the mechanical clicking of Korthak mandibles. Princess Celera stirred several times during their journey, mumbling words in her native language that Marcus couldn't understand. But each time she woke, her silver eyes would find his face, and he would see something there that gave him strength to keep moving. They reached the princess's chambers through a maintenance hatch that opened behind a decorative waterfall. The room was massive by human standards, with a ceiling that disappeared into artificial clouds and walls that displayed a living mural of Etherean history. But Marcus barely noticed the luxury. His focus was entirely on finding whatever the princess had been trying to tell him about. Behind the what, he whispered to himself, scanning the room. There were dozens of possible hiding places, ornate furniture that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, walls covered in moving artwork, and even what appeared to be a small indoor garden with plants that glowed softly in the dim light. The princess stirred in his arms and managed to lift one slender hand toward a section of the wall where the mural showed the founding of her kingdom. Marcus carried her closer and examined the artwork carefully. Unlike the rest of the moving display, this particular section seemed static, frozen in time. Setting the princess gently on a nearby chair that molded itself to support her body, Marcus pressed his hands against the wall. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, responding to something, body heat, perhaps, or genetic markers, a section of the wall dissolved away to reveal a hidden chamber. Inside was something that took Marcus's breath away. A sphere of pure energy hung suspended in the air, about the size of a human head, pulsing with colors that seemed to exist beyond the normal spectrum. Data streams flowed around it like ribbons of light, and Marcus could feel the power emanating from the device even from several feet away. This was the quantum archive the princess had mentioned. A repository of knowledge so advanced that it could store the combined wisdom of entire civilizations in a space smaller than his fist. But, as Marcus reached for it, he realized the magnitude of what he was attempting. He was just a human. A maintenance worker whose people were barely considered intelligent enough to operate simple machinery. How could he possibly protect something so valuable? How could he keep it from falling into the hands of the Korthak Empire? The answer came to him as the sounds of approaching soldiers grew louder. He couldn't protect it because he was strong or smart or important. He could protect it because he was human, and humans had one trait that even their critics acknowledged: they were stubborn beyond all reason. Marcus carefully lifted the quantum archive from its housing. The sphere was warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with contained energy. As his fingers made contact with its surface, images flashed through his mind at star maps showing the locations of ancient battleships, technical schematics for weapons that could crack planets, diplomatic codes that could turn enemies into allies. The knowledge was overwhelming, but Marcus forced himself to focus. He wrapped the archive in his work jacket and secured it inside his tool bag. Then, he turned back to the princess, who was watching him with eyes that seemed more alert than before. "You understand," she said softly, and Marcus realized she wasn't asking a question. "I understand," he replied. The princess tried to stand, but her injuries were too severe. Marcus caught her as she swayed, and once again lifted her into his arms. But this time, he felt different. This time, he carried not just the most beautiful woman in the galaxy, but also the hope of entire civilizations. The journey to the human quarters was even more treacherous than before. Korthak soldiers had spread throughout the palace, their insectoid forms moving with mechanical precision as they searched every room. Marcus had to take increasingly dangerous routes, at one point crawling through heating ducts while carrying the unconscious princess. But humans, as Marcus was beginning to realize, had advantages that other species overlooked. His smaller size allowed him to fit through spaces that would stop larger aliens. His endurance, developed through generations of persistence hunting, let him carry the princess for hours without stopping. And his ability to think creatively, to see solutions that more advanced minds might miss, kept them one step ahead of their pursuers. The human quarters were located in a section of the palace that had been built as an afterthought. The ceilings were lower, the passages narrower, and the technology simpler. To most aliens, it was a cramped and primitive area barely fit for habitation. To Marcus, it was home. He bypassed the main entrance and instead used a service tunnel that connected to the quarters' waste processing system. It wasn't glamorous, but it was secure. The Korthaks, with their superior technology and advanced sensors, would never think to look for valuable prisoners in such a humble location. Marcus's quarters consisted of 2 small rooms, a living space that doubled as a workshop, and a sleeping area just large enough for a human-sized bed. He had customized both rooms over his years of residence, adding extra storage, improved lighting, and better climate control. It wasn't much, but it was his. He laid the princess on his bed and immediately began treating her injuries with the medical supplies he kept for his work-related accidents. The plasma burn on her shoulder was serious but not life-threatening, and the cuts from debris were mostly superficial. As he worked, Marcus found himself marveling at the differences between human and Etherian physiology. Where human skin was thick and tough, hers was thin but incredibly resilient. Where human bones were dense and heavy, hers were hollow but far stronger than their weight suggested. Her blood was blue instead of red, and her heart beat in a complex rhythm that sounded almost musical. But despite all these differences, Marcus found that his basic first aid knowledge translated reasonably well. Stop bleeding, prevent infection, stabilize trauma. The fundamentals of keeping someone alive were apparently universal. As he worked, the princess drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in her own language, sometimes in the common tongue used throughout the galaxy. During her lucid moments, she would watch Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why?" she asked during one of these moments. "Why are you helping me?" Marcus paused in his work, considering the question. Why was he helping her? It would have been safer to leave her in the courtyard and save himself. It would have been smarter to surrender the quantum archive to the courthacks and hope for mercy. It would have been more logical to think of his own survival first. "Because it's the right thing to do," Marcus finally answered. The princess was quiet for a long moment. Then, she said, "Your people are not what we thought they were." "What did you think we were?" "Simple. Primitive. Content with serving others." She struggled to sit up, and Marcus helped her lean against the wall. "But, you carry the hopes of civilizations without being asked. You risk everything for someone you barely know. You see solutions where others see only problems." Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." "Yes," the princess said with something that might have been wonder in her voice. "That is exactly what makes you extraordinary." Over the next several hours, as the sounds of battle raged through the palace above them, Marcus and Princess Celera planned their next move. The quantum archive couldn't remain hidden forever, and the princess's injuries, while stabilized, required proper medical attention that Marcus couldn't provide. But their conversation revealed something that changed everything Marcus thought he knew about the galactic situation. The Korthak invasion wasn't random aggression. It was part of a larger plan to eliminate the influence of peaceful species and establish a new order based on strength and brutality. "They have already conquered 12 worlds," the princess explained, her voice growing stronger as the pain medication Marcus had given her took effect. "Each time, they take the intellectual and cultural treasures and destroy everything else. They are not just building an empire. They are erasing the possibility of any alternative to their way of life." Marcus absorbed this information as he continued to monitor the situation outside their hiding place. Through the palace's communication system, which he could access through his maintenance terminals, he could hear reports from across the planet. The invasion was proceeding exactly as the princess described. Cities were being occupied, libraries burned, and anyone who resisted was being eliminated. "What about the other species in the Federation?" Marcus asked. "Surely they won't just stand by and watch this happen." The princess's expression grew sad. "The Federation is not what it once was. Too many species have become comfortable with peace. They have forgotten how to fight, how to sacrifice, how to take risks for something greater than themselves." "But humans remember," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes. Humans remember." As the night wore on, Marcus began to understand the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about saving one princess or protecting one archive. This was about the future of galactic civilization itself. And, somehow, despite being considered the weakest species in the galaxy, humanity had a crucial role to play. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. For 3 years, Marcus had accepted his place as a simple maintenance worker, grateful just to be allowed to live and work among the stars. But now he was beginning to understand that his people had been underestimated in the most profound way possible. Princess Celera seemed to sense his thoughts. "Your people have something that others have lost," she said softly. "The willingness to risk everything for what is right. The ability to find hope in impossible situations. The strength to keep fighting when victory seems impossible. You're talking about the archives, Marcus realized. They don't just contain technology and star maps. They contain something else. Yes. They contain the records of every species that has ever chosen courage over safety, sacrifice over survival, hope over despair. Your people are not in those records yet, but, after tonight. She looked at him with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment. After tonight, humanity will be remembered as the species that saved the galaxy. Marcus felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. But, surprisingly, it didn't feel crushing. Instead, it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't even known he was trying to solve. So what do we do now? He asked. Now, the princess said, managing to smile despite her injuries, we show the galaxy what humans are truly capable of. As dawn approached over the conquered palace, Marcus Chen began to plan the most important maintenance job of his life. He was going to fix the galaxy, one impossible step at a time. And he was going to do it the way humans always did everything, with stubbornness, creativity, and a complete refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. The quantum archive pulsed softly in its hiding place, waiting for the moment when its secrets would be unleashed. The princess rested as her body healed, preparing for the trials ahead. And Marcus worked at his terminal, using his knowledge of the palace's systems to begin the first phase of what would become known throughout galactic history as the human solution. Outside, the Korthak Empire celebrated their victory, confident that they had eliminated another obstacle to their galactic dominance. They had no idea that in the depths of their newest conquest, a maintenance worker and a princess were about to change everything. The galaxy was about to learn what it truly meant to be human. 3 days had passed since the fall of Etheria, and the galaxy was beginning to understand the true scope of the Korthak conquest. News feeds across 100 worlds showed the same devastating images: crystalline cities reduced to rubble, peaceful populations herded into processing centers, and the distinctive black banners of the Korthak Empire rising over another fallen capital. But, in the depths of the conquered palace, something unprecedented was happening. Marcus Chen, a human maintenance worker who should have been dead or captured by now, was conducting the most elaborate repair job in galactic history. And his primary assistant was Princess Celera, heir to the throne of Etheria, who was supposed to be either dead or in Korthak custody. The Quantum Archive had revealed secrets that went far beyond military technology or diplomatic codes. Hidden within its data streams were the historical records of something called the Resistance Protocol, a contingency plan created by the galaxy's founders for exactly this type of catastrophic situation. The ancients knew, Princess Celera explained as she helped Marcus navigate the complex data structures. Her injuries had healed remarkably quickly, aided by medications from Marcus's surprisingly well-stocked medical kit. They knew that eventually, a species like the Korthaks would emerge. So they created a failsafe. Marcus studied the information flowing across his improvised display screen. The Resistance Protocol wasn't just a military plan, it was a complete framework for coordinating resistance across multiple worlds, using hidden networks that the founders had embedded in the infrastructure of every major civilization. But it requires activation codes, Marcus noted, pointing to a section of the display. And those codes can only be provided by someone of royal blood from each participating world. Which is why they needed to capture me alive, the princess realized. Without royal authorization, they can't fully control our planetary systems. And, without those systems, they can't coordinate their empire effectively, Marcus finished. So if we can activate the Resistance Protocol before they break you, we can turn their greatest strength against them. It was an elegant solution, but it had one massive problem. The activation process required physical access to hidden terminals scattered across dozens of worlds, many of which were now under Korthak control. It would take a coordinated effort involving hundreds of people, perfect timing, and more luck than anyone had a right to expect. In other words, it was exactly the kind of impossible task that humans specialized in. Marcus spent the next several hours studying the terminal locations and access requirements. The nearest activation point was in the palace itself, hidden within the central computer core that controlled Etheria's planetary systems. But reaching it would require traveling through the most heavily guarded section of the building, past dozens of Korthak soldiers and their automated defenses. There's another problem, Princess Celera said as she reviewed the data alongside him. Even if we activate the protocol here, someone needs to reach the other terminals on other worlds. And, with the Korthak fleet controlling all major space routes, we need help, Marcus agreed. But, who's going to believe a human maintenance worker and a supposedly dead princess? The answer to that question came from an unexpected source. As Marcus worked on modifying his communication equipment to send a secure message off-world, his terminal received an incoming signal on an emergency frequency that shouldn't have existed anymore. "This is Captain Sarah Rodriguez of the Earth Defense Corps vessel Endurance," came a voice that made Marcus's heart skip. "We are conducting emergency evacuations in the Etheria system. Any survivors, please respond immediately." Marcus stared at the display in shock. Earth Defense Corps vessels were small, lightly armed ships that were generally used for rescue operations and supply runs. They weren't military vessels by any stretch of the imagination. What was one doing in a system that the Korthaks had supposedly secured? "Respond," Princess Solera urged. "If there are other humans here." Marcus activated his transmitter with hands that trembled slightly. "This is Marcus Chen, responding from the Etherian Palace. I have Princess Solera with me, and we're in possession of critical intelligence." The response came back immediately. "Marcus, this is Sarah. We've been searching for survivors for 3 days. Can you reach the old maintenance tunnel that leads to landing pad 7? Marcus knew the tunnel she was referring to. It was one of the routes he had used to carry the princess to safety, but it would mean traveling back through areas that were now crawling with enemy soldiers. "It's possible," Marcus replied. "But it's going to be dangerous." "Roger that. We'll be there in 2 hours. Don't try to move until you see our signal." As the communication ended, Marcus turned to find Princess Solera watching him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. It was the same look she had given him in the courtyard when she realized he was going to save her, and again when he had retrieved the quantum archive despite the obvious danger. "Your people," she said softly. "They came back for you." "They came back for everyone," Marcus corrected. "That's what humans do." The next 2 hours were among the longest of Marcus's life. He and the princess prepared for their escape, gathering the quantum archive and the medical supplies, and planning their route through the palace. But, more than that, they talked. Marcus learned that Princess Solera had spent years studying human culture and history, fascinated by a species that seemed to thrive on doing the impossible. She had read about their wars, their explorations, their art and literature. She understood better than most aliens what humans were capable of when they were properly motivated. "Your species has a saying," she said as they waited for Captain Rodriguez's signal. "Something about it being darkest before the dawn." "Yes, but I never really understood what it meant until now," Marcus replied. "It means that your people have learned to find hope in hopelessness, to see opportunity in disaster, to turn their greatest weaknesses into their greatest strengths." Princess Solera was right, Marcus realized. Humans had always been underestimated, and they had always used that underestimation as an advantage. The galaxy saw them as weak, so they became strong in ways that strength couldn't counter. They were seen as primitive, so they became creative in ways that advanced civilizations couldn't predict. They were seen as unimportant, so they became essential in ways that nobody noticed until it was too late. The signal came exactly on time, a brief flash of light from the direction of landing pad 7, followed by 2 shorter flashes. Marcus and Princess Solera gathered their supplies and began the treacherous journey through the palace. The route to the maintenance tunnel required them to cross 3 major corridors that were patrolled by Korthak soldiers. Marcus had studied their patterns for hours, timing their movements and identifying gaps in their coverage. But, knowing something intellectually and executing it under pressure were 2 very different things. The first corridor crossing went smoothly. Marcus and the princess moved during a shift change, sliding across the open space while the guards were focused on their handover procedures. The second crossing was more challenging, requiring them to wait nearly 20 minutes for the right opportunity. But, the third crossing nearly ended in disaster. They were halfway across when a Korthak patrol unexpectedly changed course, heading directly toward their position. Marcus grabbed Princess Solera and pulled her into an alcove that housed a decorative fountain, pressing both of them against the wall as the alien soldiers passed within arm's reach. Marcus could smell the courthacks as they walked by, a chemical scent like burning metal mixed with something organic and unpleasant. Their chitinous armor clicked rhythmically as they moved, and he could hear the quiet whirring of their enhanced sensory equipment scanning for signs of life. For a moment, one of the soldiers paused directly in front of their hiding place. Marcus held his breath, acutely aware of Princess Solera's warm body pressed against his, of the quantum archive's weight in his pack, of everything that would be lost if they were discovered now. Then, the soldier moved on, and they were alone again. The maintenance tunnel was exactly as Marcus remembered it, cramped, dusty, and completely ignored by anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. As they crawled through the narrow passage, Princess Solera whispered, "How did you know about this place?" "I've spent 3 years learning every corner of this palace," Marcus replied. "Maintenance workers see everything that others miss." They emerged at landing pad 7 to find a sight that took Marcus's breath away. The Earth Defense Corps vessel Endurance was indeed small by galactic standards, but it was beautiful in the way that only human engineering could achieve. Where alien ships were elegant curves or geometric perfection, human ships were all function and determination, angular, practical, and absolutely refusing to apologize for what they were. Captain Sarah Rodriguez turned out to be a woman about Marcus's age, with short dark hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of making life or death decisions. She embraced Marcus like a long-lost brother, then turned to Princess Solera with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that one leader gives to another. "Your Highness," she said with a slight bow. "Earth stands ready to assist in any way possible." "Captain Rodriguez," the princess replied formally. "I am honored to meet you. Your people have already done more than could have been expected." As they boarded the Endurance, Marcus was struck by the contrast between the ship's small size and the sophisticated equipment it contained. Every available space was packed with sensors, communication gear, medical equipment, or weaponry. It was the kind of efficient use of limited resources that humans excelled at. "How many ships do you have in the system?" Princess Solera asked as they settled into the ship's small passenger compartment. "Just us," Captain Rodriguez replied. "But we're not operating alone." As the Endurance lifted off from the landing pad, its stealth systems engaged to avoid detection by the Korthak fleet, Captain Rodriguez explained what Marcus and the princess couldn't have known from their hiding place in the palace. The fall of Etheria had triggered something unprecedented in galactic history. For the first time ever, humanity had acted without permission, without orders, and without concern for the political consequences. Within hours of receiving news of the invasion, human ships had begun appearing in systems throughout Korthak space. They weren't military vessels. Humans didn't have a proper military by galactic standards. They were exploration ships, cargo haulers, research vessels, and emergency response craft. Individually, they were no match for Korthak warships. But, collectively, they were doing something that no one had expected. They were winning. "The Korthaks are designed to fight traditional military forces," Captain Rodriguez explained as her ship navigated through the outer reaches of the Etherian system. "They expect large fleets engaging in direct combat. They have no idea how to respond to 1,000 small ships appearing randomly throughout their territory, conducting hit-and-run attacks, and disappearing before they can retaliate." Marcus felt a surge of pride in his species that surprised him with its intensity. "We're using guerrilla tactics on a galactic scale." "Exactly. And it's working better than anyone imagined. The Korthaks are having to spread their forces thin to protect all their holdings, which means they can't concentrate enough power to complete their conquests." But, as impressive as the human response had been, Captain Rodriguez had sobering news about the larger situation. The Korthak Empire was vast, with resources that dwarfed anything humanity could bring to bear. Their current tactics were effective in the short term, but they couldn't sustain this kind of operation indefinitely. "We need to end this war quickly," she said, "before they adapt to our tactics or bring in reinforcements from their core territories." That was when Princess Solera shared the information about the resistance protocol. As she explained the system of hidden terminals and the possibility of turning the Korthak's own infrastructure against them, Captain Rodriguez's expression grew more and more excited. "This could work," she said finally. "We have ships positioned throughout their territory. if we can coordinate the activation sequence. It will require perfect timing, Marcus warned. And a lot of trust from species that have never worked with humans before. Then, we'll have to earn that trust, Captain Rodriguez replied with the kind of simple determination that Marcus was beginning to recognize as quintessentially human. The Endurance rendezvoused with a small fleet of human ships at a coordinates beyond the Etherian system. Marcus counted 12 vessels in total, representing the largest gathering of human spacecraft he had ever seen. As Princess Solera transmitted the Resistance Protocol data to the other ships, Marcus found himself at the center of a planning session that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The plan that emerged was audacious even by human standards. Instead of trying to coordinate the activation sequence from a central location, they would split into smaller groups and activate multiple terminals simultaneously. This would prevent the court hacks from stopping the process once it began, but it would also mean that many of the human crews would be operating deep in enemy territory with no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. It's a suicide mission, one of the ship captains pointed out during the planning session. Only if we fail, Captain Rodriguez replied. If we succeed, we save the galaxy. If we fail, the galaxy falls anyway. Those seem like acceptable odds to me. Marcus watched the faces of the other humans around the table as they absorbed the magnitude of what they were being asked to do. These weren't professional soldiers or trained heroes. They were explorers, merchants, scientists, and emergency responders. But, as he looked at each of them, he saw the same expression that he had seen in the mirror during his 3 days in hiding with Princess Solera. They were going to do it. Not because they were sure they could succeed, but because it was the right thing to do. Princess Solera would accompany the group targeting the most heavily defended terminal, located in the Korthak Empire's regional command center. Her royal blood was essential for the activation process, but her presence would also make that team the most valuable target for enemy forces. Marcus volunteered to go with her. "You don't have to do this," she said when they had a moment alone. "You've already done more than enough." "I know," Marcus replied. "But I want to see this through to the end." "Even if the end is death?" Marcus thought about that question seriously. 3 days ago, the idea of dying for someone he barely knew would have seemed insane. But something had changed during their time together in the palace. He had discovered something about himself, and about his species, that he couldn't ignore. "Especially if the end is death," he said finally. "Because that's when it matters most." Princess Solera studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. We will face the end together." As the human fleet prepared to scatter across the galaxy for the most important mission in its history, Marcus Chen found himself thinking about the maintenance work he had been doing when this all began. He had been fixing atmospheric processors, making sure that diverse species could breathe the same air and work together in harmony. Now he was attempting to fix something much larger, the broken trust between civilizations, the corrupted balance of power that had allowed the Korthak Empire to rise, and the dangerous assumption that strength was the only thing that mattered in the universe. It was still maintenance work, he realized. It was just maintenance work on a galactic scale. The quantum archive pulsed softly in his pack as the Endurance began its journey toward the most dangerous facility in Korthak space. Soon, the galaxy would discover what happened when humanity decided to fix something that everyone else had given up on. Marcus smiled as he watched the stars stream past the ship's viewport. He had always been good at fixing things that others thought were beyond repair. The Korthak Regional Command Facility hung in space like a mechanical cancer, its dark metal surface bristling with weapon emplacements and sensor arrays. Built to project power across a dozen conquered systems, it was a monument to the Empire's philosophy that strength was the only virtue that mattered in the universe. Marcus Chen studied the facility through the Endurance's enhanced sensors as Captain Rodriguez maneuvered their ship through the asteroid field that would provide their final approach cover. After 6 days of travel through Korthak-controlled space, using every stealth technique that human ingenuity could devise, they were finally at their target. The journey had been a constant exercise in creative problem-solving. Unlike the massive ships favored by most galactic civilizations, human vessels were small enough to hide behind asteroids, agile enough to mimic natural objects, and efficient enough to operate on minimal power signatures. They had passed within scanner range of Korthak patrols 3 times, and each time their ship had been dismissed as space debris. underestimation Princess Celera had observed during one particularly close encounter. It really is humanity's greatest weapon. Now, as they prepared for the most dangerous phase of their mission, Marcus felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. Across the galaxy, 11 other human ships were approaching their assigned targets, each carrying crews that had volunteered for what everyone understood was likely a one-way mission. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, which Marcus had learned was often the hallmark of the best human strategies. While the Cortax expected complex military operations involving massive fleets and prolonged campaigns, the humans had chosen to strike everywhere at once with surgical precision. At exactly the same moment, in 12 different locations across Cortax space, human teams would infiltrate heavily defended facilities and activate the ancient terminals that would trigger the resistance protocol. If even half of them succeeded, the resulting cascade failure would cripple the Empire's ability to coordinate its forces. But success would require more than just reaching the terminals. It would require Princess Celera to provide the royal authentication codes that would unlock systems that had been dormant for thousands of years. And it would require Marcus to interface those ancient systems with the quantum archive's data streams in ways that had never been attempted before. "You realize," Captain Rodriguez said as she guided the Endurance toward a docking port that their intelligence suggested was lightly defended, "that we're about to attempt the most complicated maintenance operation in galactic history." Marcus checked the equipment he had assembled for the infiltration, a collection of human tools, Etherian interface devices, and improvised connectors that looked like they had been built in someone's basement. Which, he reflected, was more or less accurate. "All maintenance is the same," he replied. "Find out what's broken, figure out why it's broken, and fix it in a way that keeps it from breaking again." "And if you can't fix it?" Marcus thought about that question as he sealed the quantum archive inside a specially designed carrying case. Over the past week, he had come to understand that this mission was about more than just stopping the Cortac Empire. It was about proving that there was an alternative to their philosophy of conquest through strength. "Then, we make sure everyone knows we tried," he said finally. The docking procedure took nearly an hour, as Captain Rodriguez used every trick she had learned in 20 years of piloting to avoid the facility's automated defense systems. The Endurance attached to a maintenance port that was designed for cargo shuttles, using a universal docking adapter that had been modified with components salvaged from a dozen different ship types. "The maintenance section should be less heavily guarded," Princess Celera said as they prepared to board the facility. "The Cortax focused their security on areas they consider important." "Which means they'll underestimate us right up until the moment we succeed," Marcus replied. The facility's interior was a maze of corridors that seemed designed to intimidate rather than facilitate movement. Everything was built on a scale intended for the Cortax 7-foot-tall frames, with lighting that favored their insectoid vision and air that carried the chemical sense they used for communication. But Marcus had spent years working in environments designed for other species, and he had learned to adapt. As they moved through the facility's lower levels, he used his knowledge of universal maintenance protocols to navigate toward the central computer core where the ancient terminal waited. The first sign that their mission might succeed came when they encountered a section of the facility that was clearly older than the rest. The walls here were made of a different material, and the architectural style was more organic, suggesting construction by one of the species that the Cortax had conquered and absorbed into their empire. "The Valari," Princess Celera whispered as they examined the ancient construction. "They built these facilities as research stations thousands of years ago. The Cortax simply took them over." Marcus felt a surge of anger at the casual way the Cortax had erased entire civilizations, but he forced himself to focus on the mission. They were here to make sure that no more species suffered the same fate. The terminal was exactly where the quantum archive had indicated it would be, in a chamber at the heart of the facility's original structure, hidden behind layers of Cortac modifications but still fundamentally intact. As they entered the chamber, Marcus felt a sense of awe at what they were seeing. The terminal itself was a work of art as much as technology. Carved from what appeared to be a single piece of crystal, it rose from the floor like a frozen waterfall, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as Marcus watched them. Data streams flowed through the crystal like living light, creating patterns that were both beautiful and incomprehensible. "The ancients built this to last," Princess Celera said softly. "They knew that one day, someone would need to wake it up." Marcus set down his equipment and began the delicate process of interfacing the quantum archive with the ancient terminal. The two technologies were separated by millennia of development, but the principles underlying both were surprisingly similar. Information was information, regardless of how it was stored or processed. As he worked, Marcus became aware that they were not alone in the facility. Through the walls, he could hear the sounds of Korthak soldiers moving with increased urgency. Either they had been discovered, or something else was happening that had put the facility on high alert. The other teams, Princess Celera realized. They'd begun their attacks. Marcus checked his chronometer and confirmed that they were exactly on schedule. At this moment, human infiltration teams throughout Korthak space were attempting to reach their assigned terminals. The Empire's forces were probably scrambling to respond to multiple simultaneous threats, which meant that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "How much longer do you need?" the princess asked. Marcus studied the interface he was building between the quantum archive and the ancient terminal. It was like trying to connect a modern computer to a device that operated on principles he barely understood. But, as he worked, patterns began to emerge that reminded him of other repair jobs he had done over the years. "Every system has its own logic," he muttered as he adjusted a connection that seemed to be causing interference. "You just have to figure out what it's trying to tell you." The breakthrough came when Marcus stopped trying to force the two systems to communicate directly and, instead, created a translation layer using components from both technologies. The quantum archive would provide the data streams, the ancient terminal would process them according to its original programming, and his improvised interface would make sure that the information flowed correctly between them. "It's working," Princess Celera breathed as the terminal began to respond to Marcus's modifications. The crystal structure was glowing more brightly now, and the symbols on its surface were moving with increasing speed. But, as the terminal came to life, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Through the chamber's walls, they could hear the heavy footsteps of Korthak soldiers running toward their location. "They know we're here," Marcus said as he made the final connections. "How long do you need for the authentication?" Princess Celera placed her hands on the terminal's crystal surface, and immediately the symbols began rearranging themselves into new patterns. "The system is scanning my genetic markers," she explained. "It should only take a few moments to confirm my royal lineage." The sounds of approaching soldiers grew louder, accompanied by the whining of energy weapons charging. Marcus estimated that they had perhaps a minute before the Korthaks reached their chamber. "Can you hold them off?" Princess Celera asked without taking her hands off the terminal. Marcus looked around the chamber for anything he could use as a weapon or defensive position. He wasn't a soldier, and he had no illusions about his ability to fight trained Korthak warriors. But he had spent years solving problems with whatever tools were available, and this was just another problem that needed solving. The chamber's only entrance was a doorway about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, dimensions that favored human proportions over Korthak frames. Marcus quickly began positioning pieces of his equipment to create a bottleneck that would force the soldiers to enter one at a time. It wasn't much of a defensive position, but it might buy them the time they needed. The first Korthak soldier through the doorway was clearly not expecting organized resistance from a human maintenance worker. Marcus's improvised barricade caught the warrior off guard, and a shower of sparks from a deliberately overloaded power cell temporarily blinded the soldier's enhanced vision systems. Marcus used those few seconds to grab a crystalline formation from the chamber wall and bring it down on the soldier's head with all the force he could muster. The Korthak dropped, more from surprise than actual damage, but it gave Marcus time to secure the warrior's weapon. The energy rifle was designed for hands much larger than his, but Marcus had years of experience adapting alien technology to human use. As the second soldier entered the chamber, Marcus managed to fire a blast that sent the warrior stumbling backward into the corridor. "How much longer?" he called to Princess Celera without taking his eyes off the doorway. "The system is asking for additional verification," she replied, strain evident in her voice. "It's been so long since anyone tried to access the protocol that the security measures are being extra careful." More soldiers were gathering in the corridor outside, and Marcus could hear them discussing tactics in their chittering language. They were probably calling for reinforcements and heavier weapons. His improvised defensive position wouldn't hold for much longer. That was when Marcus heard something that changed everything. Through the facility's walls, carried by the ventilation systems and structural supports, came the sound of explosions. Not the controlled detonations that the court hacks might use to breach their chamber, but the chaotic sounds of a facility under attack from multiple directions. The other teams, Marcus realized. They're succeeding. As if summoned by his words, the terminal suddenly flared with brilliant light. Princess Celera stepped back from the crystal surface, her eyes wide with amazement. "It's done," she said. "The resistance protocol is active." Marcus felt the change immediately. Throughout the facility, systems that had been dormant for millennia were awakening. The lights flickered as power was redirected to circuits that hadn't been used in thousands of years. The air recycling system changed its rhythm as ancient programs took control of environmental systems. And then, throughout Korthak space, the Empire's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. The Korthaks had built their empire by conquering existing civilizations and absorbing their infrastructure. They had taken over communication networks, transportation systems, industrial facilities, and administrative centers without bothering to understand the deeper principles underlying those systems. Now, as the resistance protocol activated across dozens of worlds, those systems began to turn against their conquerors. Communication networks that the Korthaks used to coordinate their forces suddenly began broadcasting the locations of resistance groups and the weaknesses of military installations. Transportation systems that moved troops and supplies began redirecting shipments to rebel forces. Industrial facilities that produced weapons and equipment began manufacturing defective products or shutting down entirely. Most importantly, the administrative systems that managed conquered populations began releasing prisoners, opening secure facilities, and providing intelligence about Korthak operations to anyone who requested it. Marcus watched through the terminal's displays as the cascade failure spread across the Empire. It was like watching a massive machine fall apart as every component simultaneously decided to stop cooperating. "This is what they feared," Princess Celera said with wonder in her voice. "This is why the ancients built the protocol. They knew that conquest without understanding would always be vulnerable to this kind of systematic failure." The sounds of combat outside their chamber had changed character. Instead of organized soldiers attempting to breach their position, Marcus could hear confused voices and the sounds of equipment malfunctioning. The facility's own security systems were beginning to work against the Korthaks. But, even as the resistance protocol worked its way through the Empire's infrastructure, Marcus knew that their personal situation remained dangerous. The Korthaks in this facility might not be able to coordinate with their empire anymore, but they were still armed and dangerous. "We need to get back to the ship," he said as he began gathering his equipment. The journey back to the Endurance was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. The facility's corridors were in chaos as Korthak soldiers struggled to understand why their equipment was malfunctioning and their orders were being contradicted by their own computer systems. Marcus and Princess Celera moved through the confusion like ghosts, using the facility's own layout against its occupants. When they needed to avoid a patrol, convenient maintenance passages opened at exactly the right moments. When they needed to cross a secured area, security doors mysteriously failed to lock. It was as if the facility itself was helping them escape. They reached the docking port to find Captain Rodriguez waiting with the Endurance's engines already warming up. As they boarded the ship, Marcus could see through the viewport that the Korthak fleet in the system was in complete disarray. Ships were drifting without power, others were firing on each other due to conflicted command signals, and several were actually broadcasting surrender messages. "Status report from the other teams," Captain Rodriguez said as they strapped in for immediate departure. 11 successful activations, one team still en route to their target. The resistance protocol is active across 73% of Korthak space. Marcus felt a surge of pride in his fellow humans that was almost overwhelming. 12 small ships, crewed by volunteers who had never trained for military operations, had just accomplished what the galaxy's professional military forces had believed was impossible. "What happens now?" Princess Celera asked as the Endurance cleared the facility and began its journey toward free space. "Now," Captain Rodriguez replied with a smile that reminded Marcus why he had always been proud to be human, "we go home and let the galaxy know that humanity is ready to take its place among the stars." As they traveled back toward human space, Marcus had time to reflect on everything that had happened since that moment in the Etherian courtyard when he had decided to save a dying princess. In the space of just over a week, he had discovered capabilities within himself that he never knew existed, formed an alliance between species that had seemed impossible, and participated in the overthrow of an empire that had appeared unstoppable. But, more than that, he had helped prove something that would change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. They weren't the weak, primitive species that others had assumed them to be. They were the species that could find hope in hopelessness, strength in weakness, and solutions where others saw only problems. The quantum archive now contained not just the technological secrets of ancient civilizations, but also the complete records of humanity's first major contribution to galactic civilization. Future generations would study the human solution to the Korthak crisis and learn that sometimes the best way to fix something was to approach it from a direction that no one else had considered. Princess Celera had been remarkably quiet during the journey home, spending most of her time reviewing the data from the Resistance Protocol activation. As they neared human space, she finally shared what she had discovered. The protocol didn't just defeat the Korthak Empire, she said. It restored the infrastructure of dozens of conquered civilizations. Worlds that were thought to be permanently lost are already beginning to rebuild. The ancients were thorough, Marcus replied. Yes, but there's something else. The protocol has identified humanity as the successor civilization, the species responsible for maintaining galactic stability until the other races can recover from the Korthak occupation. Marcus absorbed this information with the same calm acceptance that he had applied to every other impossible situation he had faced over the past week. So instead of being maintenance workers for other species, we're going to be maintenance workers for the entire galaxy. Does that bother you? Marcus thought about that question as he watched Earth grow larger in the Endurance's main viewport. It was a small, blue-green world that had produced a species capable of fixing problems that the rest of the galaxy had given up on. Not because humans were stronger or smarter or more advanced than anyone else, but because they had learned to see solutions where others saw only obstacles. No, he said finally. I think I'm looking forward to it. The welcome they received on Earth exceeded anything Marcus could have imagined. The 12 ships that had scattered across the galaxy to activate the Resistance Protocol returned to find their homeworld celebrating the greatest victory in human history. But, more than that, they returned to find humanity transformed. The galaxy's perception of humans had changed overnight. Instead of being seen as servants and maintenance workers, they were now recognized as the species that had saved galactic civilization from the greatest threat it had ever faced. Diplomatic missions from dozens of worlds were already en route to Earth, seeking alliances and partnerships with the people who had accomplished the impossible. Marcus found himself at the center of the celebration, but the attention made him uncomfortable. He had never sought fame or recognition, he had simply done what needed to be done, the way humans always did. It was Princess Celera who helped him understand the true significance of what had happened. You didn't just save my life, she said during a quiet moment away from the crowds. You saved the idea that strength isn't the only thing that matters in the universe. You proved that sometimes the most powerful force in the galaxy is someone who refuses to give up when everyone else has lost hope. We proved it, Marcus corrected. None of this would have worked without you. Perhaps. But it was your people who chose to act when action seemed hopeless. It was your people who risked everything for beings they barely knew. It was your people who found a way to turn the Empire's strength against itself. Princess Celera paused, then added, the galaxy owes humanity a debt that can never be repaid. But, more than that, humanity has earned something that can't be given or taken away. What's that? Respect. The knowledge that when the galaxy faces its darkest hour, there will always be someone willing to risk everything to make things right. As the celebrations continued around them, Marcus Chen looked up at the stars and thought about the quantum archive that was even now being studied by the greatest minds humanity could produce. The ancient knowledge it contained would help his species take its place as the galaxy's protectors and problem solvers. But the most important knowledge it carried wasn't technical specifications or historical records. It was the simple truth that had driven Marcus to save a dying princess and risk everything for beings he had never met. Sometimes, the most important maintenance work was fixing the things that others had given up on. And humans, it turned out, were very good at fixing things. 3 months later, Marcus Chen stood in the newly constructed Galactic Coordination Center on Earth, watching as representatives from 47 species worked together to rebuild what the Korthak Empire had destroyed. Princess Celera, now Queen Zelera following her father's abdication in her favor, served as one of the primary coordinators of the rebuilding effort. "Any regrets?" she asked during one of their regular planning sessions. Marcus looked around at the bustling center, where humans worked alongside aliens to solve the galaxy's problems using the same principles he had learned as a maintenance worker: find out what's broken, figure out why it's broken, and fix it in a way that keeps it from breaking again. "Only one," he said. "What's that?" Marcus smiled as he watched a group of human engineers explaining their solution to an infrastructure problem that had puzzled experts for decades. "I should have realized sooner that the galaxy needed maintenance." Queen Zelera laughed, the musical sound carrying across the center and somehow making the important work everyone was doing feel just a little more joyful. "Well," she said, "I think you've figured it out now." Outside the center's windows, ships from across the galaxy came and went in a constant stream of traffic, carrying supplies, personnel, and hope to worlds that were rebuilding after centuries of oppression. And, at the center of it all was a small blue planet whose people had learned that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't strength or technology or superior firepower. It was the simple refusal to accept that something couldn't be fixed. The galaxy was in good hands.